The insistent knock echoed through the small Brooklyn apartment, sharp and out of place, a sound too polished for the worn wood of her front door. Sarah Miller paused, a half-eaten container of noodles in her hand, the scent of soy sauce and ginger suddenly seeming cheap and intrusive. Outside, the autumn evening was settling into a comfortable rhythm of distant sirens and the murmur of neighbors. But this sound, this rapping, belonged to another world. It was the sound of purpose, of money. Lily, her 8-year-old daughter, looked up from her homework, her brow furrowed with the same curiosity that was prickling Sarah's skin. Through the thin curtains, a sliver of impossible black gleamed under the street lamp, the obsidian flank of a car so expensive it seemed to absorb the light around it. Her heart gave a nervous thud. This was a mistake. It had to be. She opened the door a crack, the safety chain still latched. Standing on her crumbling stoop was a man who looked as if he'd been carved from granite and dressed by kings. His suit was a dark, tailored masterpiece. His shoes reflected the dim hallway light with a defiant shine, and his presence seemed to shrink the already narrow space. He was impossibly tall, with a face that was all sharp angles and controlled intensity, but it was his eyes that stopped her breath, deep-set, piercing, and haunted by a shadow she recognized with a jolt that traveled from her throat to her toes. A decade-old memory, monochrome and rain-slicked, flashed in her mind. "Sarah Miller?" the man asked. His voice was a low, steady baritone, a CEO's voice, a voice that moved markets and ended careers. She swallowed, her own voice a fragile thing. "Yes. My name is Elias Sterling." He didn't need to say more. The name was a brand, a myth whispered in financial columns and tech blogs, a billionaire titan. And he was standing on her doormat. "I believe you have something of mine, a photograph you took 10 years ago." But to understand the sheer seismic shock of that moment, to grasp why a man like Elias Sterling would cross a river and a decade to stand in a hallway that always smelled faintly of garlic and old books, you have to understand the world that photograph came from. Just an hour before, Sarah's world had been its usual chaotic, beautiful mess. The apartment was a testament to a life lived on the knife's edge, between artistic passion and financial precarity. Canvases leaned against walls, books were stacked on every available surface, and Lily's colorful drawings were taped to the refrigerator, a vibrant explosion of joy amidst a sea of final notice envelopes. Lily's laughter was the melody that held it all together, the sound that made the cramped two-bedroom space feel like a kingdom. Sarah was a street photographer, a custodian of the city's secret stories, her worn camera a third hand, an extension of her soul. It was her only real inheritance, a legacy of a dream she refused to defer, even when the bills screamed otherwise. Her archives were a digital ocean of unrecognized talent, thousands of moments stolen from the relentless flow of New York City life. And in that ocean, one image had always held a special, somber power. A photograph she had taken in the autumn of 2011. She could still feel the chill of the rain that day, a sudden, violent downpour that had sent the Wall Street crowd scattering for cover. But one man hadn't scattered. He sat slumped on a park bench, utterly defeated, his suit soaked through, his gaze lost in the shimmering, distorted reflections of skyscrapers in the puddles at his feet. A worn leather briefcase was clutched in his lap like a shield that had already failed. Sarah, huddled under a small awning, had raised her camera, the click of the shutter lost in the drumming of the rain. She had seen not just a man, but an archetype of broken ambition. It was a perfect, heartbreaking composition of despair against a backdrop of immense power. She had titled it, "The Architect of Dreams Deferred." For 10 years, it had remained one of her most private, powerful pieces, a solitary moment of a stranger's vulnerability that she felt she had no right to sell, only to witness. Now, that stranger stood before her, the architecture of his dreams fully, terrifyingly realized. The defeat was gone, replaced by an aura of absolute command, but the haunting quality in his eyes remained. The past was no longer a photograph. It was a living, breathing man demanding an audience. Sarah slowly unlatched the chain. If you've ever felt the crushing weight of being unseen while pouring your entire soul into your work, you understand the protective fire that ignited in Sarah's chest. For a moment, she wasn't a struggling single mother. She was an artist defending her vision. Let me know if you feel that same fire by giving this story a like. Elias Sterling stepped inside, and her small living room seemed to tilt on its axis, his sheer scale and wealth warping the dimensions of her reality. He took in the cluttered charm of her home, the half-finished painting on an easel, the pile of Lily's stuffed animals, the single wilting flower in a glass on the windowsill, and for a fraction of a second, an unreadable emotion flickered across his face. It wasn't pity or disdain. It was something closer to recognition. "The photograph," Elias Sterling repeated, his voice softer now, as if acknowledging the sanctity of the space he had just entered. "I know it's a strange request. It was taken a long time ago, but I have a critical need for it. For the original negative and all rights." Sarah crossed her arms, a defensive posture against the sheer force of his presence. "I don't sell my work that way. Especially not that piece." "I understand," he said, though it was clear he didn't. Men like him were used to a world where everything had a price tag. "Perhaps you don't grasp the gravity of my offer. I am prepared to pay you a sum that would ensure neither you nor your daughter would have to worry about anything ever again." He named a number. It was not a number. It was a fantasy. It was a lottery win, a life-altering, gravity-defying figure that hung in the air between them, shimmering with promise. It was enough to buy this whole building, enough for a dozen non-profits, enough to make her art without the constant gnawing fear of rent and bills. She felt the pull of it, a dizzying vertigo. She saw Lily's future, secure and bright. She saw a new studio, new equipment, the freedom to create without compromise. But then she looked at Elias Sterling, at the man who was no longer the broken figure on a bench but a titan of industry. And she knew this wasn't about art. It was about power. He wanted to buy a piece of his past, to own his own humiliation, to scrub it or spin it for some high-stakes corporate game she couldn't begin to imagine. The photograph wasn't just an image of him. It was a testament to her eye, her ability to see the story beneath the surface. It was a piece of her history, too. A quiet strength, forged in a decade of dignified struggle, settled over her. She thought of the raw, honest vulnerability in that young man's eyes, a truth she had promised to protect the moment she captured it. Selling it felt like a betrayal, not just of the man in the photo, but of the artist she had fought so hard to become. She met his intense gaze, her own clear and unwavering. The air crackled with the silent collision of two vastly different worlds. He saw a photograph he needed to control. She saw a soul she had a duty to honor. "Mr. Sterling," Sarah Miller said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Thank you for the offer. It's more than generous." She took a deep breath. "But the answer is no. The photograph is not for sale." The silence in the small Brooklyn apartment was a physical weight, pressing down on the worn wooden floors and the stacks of photography books that served as makeshift end tables. Elias Sterling, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms with a single glance, stood motionless, his tailored suit a stark obsidian slash against the warm, cluttered chaos of Sarah Miller's life. The astronomical figure he had named hung in the air between them, a number that could rewrite her entire existence, and she had just brushed it aside as if it were dust. "No," she had said, her voice quiet but unyielding. Now she held his gaze, her chin lifted. "Mr. Sterling, that photograph isn't a commodity. It isn't a stock option you can purchase to hedge your bets. It's a moment. My moment, as much as it was yours." Elias's jaw tightened, a flicker of disbelief in his steely gray eyes. Denial was a language he rarely encountered. "Ms. Miller, with all due respect, every single thing in this world has a price. I am offering you a very generous one, a life-changing one." "My life is already full," Sarah countered, gesturing to the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator, the half-finished mug of tea on the counter, the faint scent of rain and city grit that clung to the air. "It's complicated, and it's a struggle, but it's mine. That photograph, it represents the reason I do what I do. I saw something in the man on that bench, not failure. I saw the silence after a storm, the potential for a clear sky. Selling it feels like selling a piece of my own belief system. If you've ever had to stand up for something you believe in, even when it felt impossible, you know the courage it takes. It's a feeling that makes your heart pound, a quiet strength that deserves to be seen. Frustration radiated from Elias in palpable waves. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled dark hair, the first sign of a crack in his impenetrable facade. "You don't understand what's at stake here," he said, his voice dropping, losing its corporate polish and taking on a rougher, more urgent edge. "This isn't about sentiment. This is about survival." He took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. "I am in the middle of a hostile takeover bid. The man on the other side, Arthur Vance, he was my first mentor. He taught me everything I knew, and then he tried to destroy me when I surpassed him. He's a shark who smells blood in the water, and he is digging into every corner of my past, looking for a single moment of weakness to exploit." Sarah listened, her artist's intuition sensing the raw truth beneath the billionaire's plea. This was more than a business deal. It was a war. "Vance wants to paint me as an opportunist, a failure who got lucky," Elias continued, his voice laced with a decade of resentment. "That photograph, in his hands, becomes Exhibit A. Look at the great Elias Sterling, broken and pathetic on a park bench. He would twist it, manipulate it, and use it to assassinate my character in front of the board members whose votes I need. But if I present it first, if I frame it as the crucible that forged my resilience, it becomes my greatest strength, a testament to starting with nothing and building an empire. I don't just need the image, Ms. Miller, I need its story. I need your story of it." The confession hung between them, heavy and vulnerable. It was a glimpse of the man behind the myth, the man from her photograph. And it was in that charged silence that a small voice cut through the tension, clear as a bell. "Mommy, is that the sad man from your picture?" They both turned. Standing in the doorway of the small hallway was Lily, her small frame swallowed by a unicorn pajama top, rubbing the sleep from her 8-year-old eyes. She was pointing a small finger directly at Elias Sterling. The effect on Elias was instantaneous and devastating. It was as if a puppeteer had cut his strings. The tension drained from his shoulders, the command vanished from his posture. He wasn't a CEO anymore. He was just a man, seen through the unfiltered, unnervingly perceptive eyes of a child. He stared at Lily, his carefully constructed walls of wealth and power crumbling into dust. The sad man. It was the simplest, most honest description of who he had been that day, and hearing it from a child struck a chord of forgotten pain deep within him. Sarah moved instinctively, scooping Lily into her arms. "It's okay, sweetie. Go back to bed. We have a guest." But Lily's eyes remained fixed on Elias. "He doesn't look sad anymore," she observed, her head tilted with genuine curiosity. Elias's throat worked, but no sound came out. He looked from Lily's innocent face to Sarah's fiercely protective one, and something inside him broke. The raw, unvarnished truth he had been holding back for a decade finally spilled out, not as a strategy, but as a confession. "I was sad," he said, his voice quiet, almost hoarse. "That day, the day your mother took that picture, I had just been fired. I had poured every dollar I had, every ounce of my energy, into a company I believed in, and my partners pushed me out with nothing. I had $213 to my name. I hadn't eaten in a day. I was sitting on that bench trying to figure out how I was going to call my landlord and tell him I couldn't make rent. I felt invisible, like the entire city was moving on without me." His gaze met Sarah's over Lily's head, and for the first time she didn't see a billionaire. She saw the man on the bench. "I wasn't just sad," he admitted, the words tasting like ash. "I was terrified." The air in the room shifted. It was no longer a negotiation. It was a shared moment of human vulnerability. Sarah held Lily tighter, her heart aching with a sudden, unexpected wave of empathy. She understood that kind of fear. She lived with a version of it every day. Elias saw it in her eyes, the recognition. And in that moment, he knew he couldn't buy her art. He couldn't command her story. He had to become a part of it. He took a deep breath, his mind racing, formulating a new plan born not of corporate strategy, but of genuine insight. "This is bigger than a simple purchase," he said, his voice regaining its strength, but with a new timbre of sincerity. "I'm not asking you to sell me the past, Sarah. I'm asking you to partner with me to shape the future." He laid out a new offer, one that addressed not just her financial needs but her dreams. "This won't be a sale. It will be a contract, a partnership. You retain partial rights and full artistic credit. First, a professional fee that will ensure you and Lily are secure. Not as a buyout, but as a retainer for your services as the narrative consultant for this project." He paused, letting the weight of that sink in. "Second, my company will sponsor a series of solo exhibitions for your work, a gallery show in Soho to start, then Los Angeles, London. We will put your name, your vision, on the global stage it deserves." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. This was the dream she barely allowed herself to whisper in the dark. "And third," Elias said, his eyes flicking to Lily, who was now dozing on Sarah's shoulder, "I read about your non-profit, Lens of Hope, the one you're trying to start to teach photography to underprivileged kids." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek business card. "My foundation will provide the seed funding. $2 million to start, with a commitment to match all future donations for the next 5 years. It was a masterstroke. He wasn't just offering her money. He was offering her security for her daughter. He was offering her artistic legacy. He was offering her purpose. He was offering her a way to give back, a way to turn her own struggle into a source of hope for others. He was offering her everything. Sarah looked down at her daughter's sleeping face, at the gentle rise and fall of her small chest. This wasn't about her pride anymore. This was about Lily's future. This was about the futures of countless other kids who deserved a chance to see the world through a different lens. Elias had offered her a deal she couldn't refuse, not because of the money, but because of the meaning. She looked up, her gaze steady and clear. "I'll do it," she said, "but on one condition." Elias nodded, waiting. "No corporate whitewashing, no spin," Sarah stated, her voice firm. "When we tell this story, we tell the whole truth, the fear, the hunger, the feeling of being invisible. We tell the story of the sad man on the bench, unvarnished." A slow smile spread across Elias Sterling's face, a genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time, erasing the last traces of the sad man and revealing the leader he had become. "Unvarnished," he agreed, extending his hand. "That's the only way this story has any real power." Sarah shifted Lily in her arms and reached out, shaking his hand. The contact was brief, professional, but it sent a jolt of electricity through the room. It was the sealing of a pact, an alliance between the street photographer from Brooklyn and the titan of Wall Street. She had just made a deal to secure her daughter's future and realize her wildest dreams, not knowing that she was stepping out of the shadows and directly into the blinding, unforgiving glare of his world. The world Elias Sterling inhabited was not made of brick and mortar, but of glass and whispers. For Sarah Miller, stepping into it felt like being submerged in water, every sound muffled, every movement slow and deliberate, the pressure immense. Her first week under their contract was a blur of fittings for clothes she couldn't pronounce the names of, and polite meetings in boardrooms that were colder than the November air outside. She felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his life, an invisible woman suddenly forced into the blinding spotlight of a world that judged value by the carat of a diamond and the vintage of a wine. The first event was a cocktail party at a penthouse overlooking Central Park. The city lights glittered below like a fallen constellation, but Sarah couldn't appreciate the beauty. She felt the weight of 100 gazes, each one a silent appraisal. A woman with hair the color of spun gold and eyes as sharp as ice drifted over. "You must be the photographer," she said, her voice a silken weapon. "Elias has told us all about his little discovery. How wonderfully rustic." Sarah clutched her simple glass of water, the condensation cold against her nervous fingers. "I'm just here to help tell the story," Sarah managed, her voice feeling small in the cavernous room. The woman smiled, a perfect predatory curve of her lips. "Of course, dear. We all have our stories to sell." She turned away without another word, leaving Sarah feeling as if she'd been meticulously dissected and dismissed in under 30 seconds. Elias was across the room, a titan in his element, surrounded by men in bespoke suits. He caught her eye for a fraction of a second, a flicker of something unreadable in his expression, before he was pulled back into the gravitational pull of his world. The distance between them had never felt greater. It wasn't just the physical space of the room, it was a chasm of experience, of language, of life itself. Their collaboration was confined to sterile late-night sessions in his minimalist office, the city a silent witness through the floor-to-ceiling windows. They sat on opposite sides of a vast mahogany desk, the photograph projected on a screen between them, a bridge connecting two separate islands. The physical and emotional distance was a palpable force, a rule unspoken but strictly observed. "We need to frame the narrative," Elias said one night, his voice tired. He had loosened his tie, the first sign of vulnerability Sarah had seen in him. "My team thinks we should focus on the comeback, the triumph." Sarah stared at the image of the younger, broken Elias on the screen. "That's not the point of the photo," she said softly, but with a steel thread of conviction. "The point isn't the triumph that came later. It's the humanity in the failure. It's about being seen at your lowest moment and knowing you're not alone. That's what people connect with." Sarah leaned forward, her passion overriding her intimidation. "That man on the bench, he isn't just you, Elias, he's every person who's ever been told they weren't good enough. Every person who's risked everything and lost. If you hide that, you hide the truth, and the photograph becomes a lie." Elias Sterling was silent. He wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was looking at Sarah Miller. He was seeing the fire in her eyes, the fierce integrity that money couldn't buy and intimidation couldn't break. For the first time, he wasn't seeing the charity case or the opportunist his circle whispered about. He was seeing the artist. He was seeing the woman who had looked at his worst moment and found not weakness, but a story worth telling. A fissure, small but significant, cracked through the armor he had worn for a decade. The pre-gala dinner was the final hurdle, a gathering of the key investors and board members whose votes would decide everything. It was held in a private dining room of a restaurant so exclusive it didn't have a sign. The air was thick with the scent of money and ambition. Sarah sat beside Elias, feeling like a doll dressed in borrowed finery, her borrowed emerald necklace cold against her skin. Then Arthur Vance made his entrance. He was older than Elias, with a politician's practiced smile and eyes that held a chilling emptiness. He moved through the room with a predator's grace, shaking hands, his voice a low, confident murmur. He was Elias's former mentor, the man who had built him up only to try and tear him down. Arthur paused at their table, his gaze sweeping over Sarah with condescending amusement. "Elias, my boy," he said, his voice dripping with false warmth. "And this must be the celebrated artist, Sarah Miller, a pleasure." He took her hand, his grip lingering a moment too long. "I must say, it's a brilliant strategy, truly, finding this raw talent, plucking a diamond from the rough. It's a narrative straight out of a fairy tale." The table fell quiet. Every eye was on them. Sarah felt a hot flush creep up her neck. "It's not a strategy, Arthur," Elias said, his voice dangerously level. "It's the truth." Arthur chuckled, a low, dismissive sound. "Oh, I'm sure it is, but one has to wonder about the authenticity of it all." He turned his full attention to Sarah, his smile never wavering. "Tell me, Ms. Miller, was it pure luck? Being in the right place at the right time to capture our Elias in such a theatrical moment of despair? Or do you just have a knack for finding powerful men at their most vulnerable?" The implication was clear, a venomous dart wrapped in velvet. He was painting her as a calculating opportunist, a gold digger who had stumbled upon a winning lottery ticket. He wasn't done. "Your work," Arthur continued, gesturing vaguely with his hand, "it has a certain street-level charm, but to suggest it holds the key to a multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisition? It seems a bit far-fetched, doesn't it? Unless, of course, the art itself is secondary to the artist's personal connection to the subject." He looked from Sarah to Elias, a sly, knowing glint in his eye. He had just publicly branded her a fraud and a mistress in a single, elegant monologue. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs. She opened her mouth to defend herself, to talk about her years of work, about Lily, about the passion that drove her. But the words caught in her throat, strangled by the sheer calculated cruelty of the attack. She felt every ounce of her invisibility return tenfold. She was nothing to these people but a prop, a curiosity, a tool. But then she saw it. Elias, who had been perfectly still, moved his hand on the table. His knuckles were white. His jaw was a hard, unforgiving line. A glacial coldness had entered his eyes, an intensity that made the room seem to drop several degrees. He wasn't looking at Arthur. He was looking at Sarah, and in his gaze, she saw a flicker of the man on the bench, the humiliation, the fury, the crushing weight of being publicly stripped of one's dignity. He was seeing his own past reflected in the attack on her. This wasn't about a photograph anymore. It wasn't about a business deal. Arthur Vance, in his attempt to humiliate Sarah, had made a grave miscalculation. He had crossed a line, awakening a protective instinct in Elias that Elias himself hadn't known existed. The contract between them, a thing of paper and clauses, dissolved in that moment, replaced by something raw and fiercely personal. Elias's resolve, once focused on winning a corporate battle, now solidified into something far more profound. A need to right this wrong, to defend her honor, to make them all see her not as a tool but as the formidable, talented woman she was. He said nothing, but the silent promise in his eyes was more powerful than any shout. The war had just become personal, and the gala was now not just a boardroom, but a battlefield. The Sterling Grand Ballroom was a universe of contained starlight. Thousands of crystals dripped from the ceiling, fracturing the light into a million shimmering pieces that danced over tailored suits and silk gowns. The air, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and ambition, hummed with a low, predatory murmur. Sarah Miller, standing near a towering marble column, felt the borrowed elegance of her deep sapphire gown like a costume she might be forced to return at any moment. Across the cavernous room, she saw Arthur Vance, his silver hair immaculate, his smile a thin, confident slash. He was holding court, a circle of sycophants laughing a little too loudly at his words. He was a man who had never known a day of true desperation, and it showed in the easy, dismissive cruelty of his posture. Elias Sterling stood at the main lectern, his presence silencing the room not through volume, but through a palpable, coiled stillness. The results of the proxy vote were moments away. This was it, the culmination of weeks of tension, of Sarah being pulled from her world of shadows and light into this blinding, brutal arena. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat beneath the thin silk. "Before the final tallies are announced," Elias began, his voice calm and steady, amplified by the room's impeccable acoustics, "there is one more thing you need to see, one final piece of evidence for you to consider when you decide the future of this company." A collective, intrigued hush fell over the assembly. What could it be? A last-minute financial projection? A secret weapon? The low murmur died completely. On the massive screen behind Elias, which had been displaying the shimmering corporate logo, a new image began to resolve. It wasn't a chart or a graph. It was stark, grainy, and achingly real. It was black and white. A collective gasp, soft but audible, rippled through the ballroom. There, projected 30 feet high, was her photograph. The architect of dreams deferred. The image of a young, rain-soaked man slumped on a bench, the weight of a world's worth of failure carved into his posture. His face, turned just so, was awash in the reflected glare of skyscrapers, his eyes lost in a private, shimmering hell. The man was unmistakably a younger, broken Elias Sterling. Arthur Vance's confident smile froze, then curdled into a mask of disbelief and fury. This was his trump card, the very image he had been searching for to humiliate Elias, and here it was, presented by Elias himself. This photograph, Elias's voice was softer now, more intimate, drawing every person in the room into the rain-drenched moment on the screen, was taken 10 years ago. It captured the single worst day of my life, the day I lost everything. He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle. Then he turned, his gaze sweeping the room until it found Sarah, still half hidden by the column. And the artist who captured it is with us tonight. Sarah Miller, would you please join me? For a second, Sarah's feet were rooted to the floor. Every eye in that opulent universe turned to her. The invisible woman, the charity case, the opportunist. She could feel their judgment like a physical force. But then she met Elias's eyes, and in them she saw not a request from a billionaire CEO, but a plea from the man on the bench. He wasn't asking her to save his company. He was asking her to tell their truth. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward the stage. The rustle of her gown was the only sound in the vast, silent room. She felt hundreds of eyes dissecting her, questioning her right to be there. But as she stepped into the warm glow of the stage lights, a strange calm settled over her. This was her element, telling stories with light. She just had to use words this time. She stood beside Elias, not looking at him, but at the enormous projection of her work. "My name is Sarah Miller," she said, her voice surprisingly clear, carrying a warmth that defied the room's glacial atmosphere. "I am a photographer. I don't photograph buildings or landscapes. I photograph moments of truth, the moments in between the curated smiles and the public victories." She pointed a graceful hand toward the screen. "I took this photograph on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The rain was coming down so hard it felt like the sky was weeping. Most people were running for cover, hiding from the storm. But this man, he was just sitting there. He wasn't hiding. He was enduring." Her eyes swept over the sea of faces, landing for a brief, searing moment on Arthur Vance. Some people might look at this image and see failure. They might see weakness, a reason for dismissal. That is perhaps because they have only ever learned to see the world in terms of profit and loss, of strength and vulnerability. They see a liability. She turned back to the photograph, her voice filling with a quiet passion. "But that is not what I saw. I saw a foundation. I saw a man who had been pushed to the absolute bottom, with nothing left to lose and everything to prove to himself. Humiliation is a fire. It can consume you, or it can forge you into something stronger. What I captured in that frame wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. It was the moment before the ascent, the grit, the resilience, the silent promise to oneself to stand up and fight again. That is not a weakness, Mr. Vance. That is the most powerful asset a person can ever possess." A stunned silence held the room captive. She had not only defended Elias, she had articulated the very soul of his journey, and in doing so had exposed the hollowness of his rival's tactics without ever speaking a word of accusation. Elias stepped forward, his eyes shining with an emotion so raw and profound it took Sarah's breath away. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, and for all time. He took the microphone. "Thank you, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He turned to the audience. "What Ms. Miller just said is the truth, but it's not the whole truth." He took a deep breath. "What I haven't told anyone is that my connection to this photograph and to its artist began long before I stood on her doorstep a few weeks ago. 6 years ago, my company was facing another crisis. I was lost. I was starting to believe the voices that said I was a fluke, that my first success was a lucky break. And one night, I stumbled upon an obscure online article about emerging street photographers, and I saw this picture." He gestured to the screen. "I saw myself, and I read the artist's caption. She had titled it, 'The Architect of Dreams Deferred,' not destroyed, deferred." In that single word, this artist I had never met, Sarah Miller, gave me back my own story. She saw potential where I had only remembered pain. Her perspective, her truth, reminded me of who I was and why I started. It was her art that helped pull me out of the darkness then, just as it has now. He looked directly at Sarah again, and the entire ballroom seemed to fade away for them both. Her lens doesn't just capture images, it captures dignity. Tonight is not about a takeover. It's about what we value. Do we value the cynical tearing down of others, or do we value the resilience it takes to build something real? He turned back to the audience, his voice ringing with newfound conviction. "That is why I am announcing tonight the formation of the Sterling Foundation's first major initiative, a $50 million endowment to fund arts and storytelling programs in underserved communities across the nation. Because talent is everywhere, but opportunity is not. This initiative will be called the Lens of Hope Project, and it will be chaired by the woman who taught me how to see again, Ms. Sarah Miller. The room erupted, not with polite corporate applause, but with a genuine, thunderous ovation. It was a wave of sound, of respect, of profound emotional release. Arthur Vance was ashen, his face a mask of utter ruin. His attack had not only failed, it had been transformed into the catalyst for his enemy's greatest triumph and most profound act of public redemption. The vote, when it was finally announced a few minutes later, was a mere formality. A landslide victory for Elias Sterling, but Sarah was barely listening. All she could see was Elias walking toward her as the applause rained down. The invisible woman was now standing at the very center of the universe, bathed in light. And then something small and white drifted down from the balcony box above, where Lily had been watching with a chaperone. It was a paper airplane, spiraling gently, impossibly through the air. It landed right at Elias's feet. He bent down and picked it up. He unfolded it carefully. Inside was a child's drawing in bright purple crayon. It showed two stick figures. One was a very tall man in a suit, and the other was a woman in a blue dress with a camera around her neck. They were holding hands, and above them a giant, smiling sun. Elias looked up at Sarah, his eyes filled with a universe of gratitude, wonder, and a promise of a future she had never dared to dream of. The contract was fulfilled, the takeover was won, but in that silent, shared glance, a new, unwritten story had just begun. The aftermath of the gala was not a tidal wave, but a quiet, seismic shift that reordered the landscape of their lives. The city awoke to headlines that screamed of Elias Sterling's corporate triumph, but the stories that captured the public's imagination were not about stock prices or market consolidation. They were about the stark, black and white photograph of a broken man on a bench, and the previously unknown artist who had seen the king before the kingdom. In the days that followed, Sarah's small Brooklyn apartment, once a sanctuary of quiet struggle, became the epicenter of a new world. The phone rang incessantly with calls from galleries in London, museums in Paris, and publications that had once rejected her work without a second glance. It was overwhelming, a dizzying chorus of validation that felt both exhilarating and strangely distant. Elias, for his part, moved through the victory with a newfound gravity. The ruthless efficiency that had defined him was still there, but it was now tempered by a different kind of calculus. He cancelled a hostile negotiation for a new acquisition, an action that sent shockwaves through his board, and instead spent the afternoon on a video call with the first class of students for the newly endowed Lens of Hope Foundation. Sarah watched him on the screen from her studio, saw how he listened, truly listened, to a 14-year-old girl from the Bronx describe the world she wanted to capture. He wasn't a billionaire benefactor playing a role. He was a man rediscovering a language he had long forgotten, the language of dreams that existed before balance sheets. Their contract, the document that had been the sterile framework of their interactions, was now fulfilled. The clauses and conditions had dissolved in the bright lights of the gala stage, leaving behind an open, uncharted space between them. The careful distance, the unspoken no-touch rule that had governed their meetings was gone, replaced by a tentative, fragile intimacy. He came to her apartment 3 days after the gala, not in his chauffeured Obsidian car, but in a simple grey sedan he drove himself. He didn't text to announce his arrival. He just knocked on the door holding 2 cups of coffee from a small shop down her street. He stood in her living room, a space he had first entered as a titan of industry on a mission, and looked around as if seeing it for the first time. He noticed the worn spot on the armchair where she sat to edit her photos, the shelf of mismatched mugs, and the crayon drawings taped to the refrigerator. One of them was of him and Sarah, a new version of Lily's paper airplane masterpiece, this time with a smiling sun drawn above their heads. "Lily's latest commission," Sarah said softly, her voice catching slightly. He smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that reached the haunted eyes she had first captured a decade ago, erasing the last shadows of the man on the bench. "I'll have to frame it," Elias replied, his voice equally quiet. Their professional relationship had concluded, but their personal one was just beginning to find its words. It bloomed not in grand gestures, but in small, shared moments. He'd help her sort through a mountain of exhibition proposals, offering a perspective that was surprisingly insightful, seeing the business of art through the lens of her integrity. She, in turn, would listen as he spoke of the immense, crushing loneliness that had accompanied his rise, a solitude he was only now beginning to understand. They learned that his favorite food was a simple slice of New York pizza, and that she hummed off-key when she was concentrating. They discovered a shared love for old black-and-white films and a mutual disdain for pretentious art critics. One crisp Saturday afternoon, he took her and Lily to Central Park. As Lily chased pigeons with squeals of delight, they found themselves standing before the very bench from the photograph. It looked impossibly ordinary in the golden sunlight, stripped of the rain-soaked despair she had immortalized. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air was thick with the weight of the past and the light, hopeful possibility of the future. "I used to think this bench was the end of my world," Elias said, his gaze fixed on the worn wood. "I sat here and planned how I was going to disappear. I never imagined—" He trailed off, turning to look at her. "I never imagined that the worst moment of my life would lead me to the best one." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest, a feeling more profound than any gallery opening or magazine feature. She reached out, her fingers gently tracing the back of his hand. It was the first time she had initiated contact, a simple gesture that bridged a decade of distance. He turned his hand over and laced his fingers with hers, a silent, solid confirmation. Their connection wasn't a whirlwind romance born of glamour and galas. It was a slow, deliberate construction, built on a foundation of shared vulnerability and mutual respect. The Lens of Hope Foundation became their shared project, the physical manifestation of their new reality. The headquarters was not a sterile corporate office, but a vibrant, light-filled loft in a converted warehouse, filled with the excited chatter of young, aspiring artists. Elias was there often, not in a suit but in jeans and a sweater, sitting on the floor with a group of teenagers, discussing f-stops and shutter speeds. He wasn't just funding a project, he was investing himself, finding a purpose that eclipsed the sterile thrill of the deal. Sarah, moving through the space, felt a sense of peace she had never known. Her financial struggles were a ghost of a memory, but the true wealth was this: seeing the direct impact of her art, watching Lily thrive in a world of security and opportunity, and sharing it all with a man who saw her, completely and utterly. One evening, as the last of the students left, they stood together by the large window overlooking the city. On the main wall of the studio hung a single, beautifully framed photograph, the architect of dreams deferred. It was no longer an archived image of despair or a strategic corporate tool. It was a prologue. It was the first sentence in an epic story they were still writing. "You know," Elias said, his arm wrapping gently around her waist, pulling her close. "Arthur Vance called me. He wanted to apologize." Sarah looked up at him, surprised. "What did you say?" He paused, looking down at her, his eyes full of a soft, steady light. "I told him thank you," he said. "I told him that by trying to expose my greatest weakness, he led me to my greatest strength." He leaned down and his lips met hers, not with the fire of a sudden passion, but with the deep, resonant warmth of a long-awaited homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of second chances, of redemption, and of a future that felt as infinite as the city lights glittering below them. Elias, the man who had once built an empire of silicon and code, had found his true legacy was not in what he owned, but in what he could help create. And Sarah, the invisible photographer who had spent her life capturing the souls of others, had finally stepped into the light, her own soul seen, her lens having captured not just an image, but the beautiful, improbable trajectory of a life transformed.